Yeah, I'm just going to jump right into it. My name is Forrest Humphrey. I am the organizing coordinator for Wisconsin Farmers Union. I live in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And, you know, we all know, I'm sure, that rural America is experiencing a lot of pain. People are struggling right now. This is a critical election year. We've got NFU fly-in just a few short weeks away. The Farm Bill is on the horizon. We feel like now is the time to stand up and get a little loud for farmers and for rural communities. In this workshop, we're going to be focusing on how to tell your own personal story, how to tell your story of self, how to connect that story with the shared values of your community. That's the story of us. And how to mobilize your story in the face of an urgent challenge. That's the story of now. So to get us started, we're a pretty big group tonight, so we're going to be interacting mainly through the Zoom chat and in our breakout rooms. So I'll talk about those in a second. But to get started, if folks could drop their name, where they're from, and their pronouns in the chat, we can get started that way. And while we're doing that, I am going to do a little agenda review real quick. We're doing our introductions. We'll talk a little bit about why stories are important. We'll share a great video produced by the Wisconsin Farmers Union that highlights some stories. Then we'll talk about the story of now. We'll have a little discussion around that in our breakout rooms. We'll talk about the story of us, have a little discussion about that. And then we'll talk about the story of self.
The next available customer service specialist.
If you could go ahead and mute yourself, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you everybody for throwing your information down there in the chat. That's wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the story of self. We'll do a 20-minute exercise. And then we'll close it out. It'll bring us home. So just some basic Zoom stuff. Just keep yourself on mute unless you're in the breakout room. If you feel like you can, please keep your video on. Feel free to ask questions and type in the chat if you'd like to contribute. We'll be breaking into some breakout rooms, a couple different points throughout the evening, and we'll try to keep you all in the same breakout rooms each time so you can get to know each other a little bit. I also shared with you in my emails a little handout. It has some questions that we're going to be asking when we're in the breakout rooms, as well as our final storytelling exercise. If you could have that open, I'd really appreciate that. And maybe we could drop that handout in the chat. That would be really wonderful.
Businesses, windows and baths unlimited.
Cool. Well, with our introductions out of the way, I think I'm just going to jump right into it. So we've got I just want to acknowledge that this presentation is adapted from the work of Marshall Gans, Dan Granholm, and the Wisconsin Leadership Development Project, as well as the Leading Change Network, and of course, many dedicated organizers and partners. So we're really grateful to them for all this information, and we're excited to share it with you tonight. So why stories? Stories are important because they are vehicles for how we communicate our values, right? Human beings, we understand the world in a couple different ways. First, we understand the world cognitively, of course, using strategy, analysis, experimentation. When we encounter a problem in our lives, we employ this cognitive mapping to figure out how we solve that problem. This how is very important, of course, but equally important is the why. This is where narrative mapping comes in, right? We code things as helpful or harmful, uplifting or depressing, good or bad. And we often do this using stories. Right? So that's narrative mapping. So today in this workshop, we're going to be exploring not the how, but the why. This why is our values, our experiences from our lives that have brought us here today, and make us want to address some of the big problems and uncertainties in farming or in our rural communities. So what does telling your story look like in practice? Well, many of you may be going to NFU fly-in DC very soon. Others of you might want to share your story with your local elected officials or your friends or your neighbors, right? And I will say in DC, you'll probably be sharing your stories with lawmakers, right? You might want to share your story in a written form as a letter to the editor or an op-ed. So in each case, though, the basic framework is the same. This is the framework we're going to be talking about throughout our time together tonight. And that is the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that, Forrest. So I have people as a journalist, I have people all the time ask me, you guys, why do I write the stories that I do? How do news reporters decide what's the news and why do we do it? And I'll make it more broad because reporting is just one narrow part of storytelling. But why do we as people tell the stories that we do? You know, some of these stories are kind of no-brainers. They're us talking about the weather or what's happening in our neighborhoods, maybe something about downtown redevelopment. But some other stories, they're more in-depth and they reflect really important issues happening in our communities, maybe statewide, maybe nationwide. And they're questions that sometimes need answering. Stories, when they're done or told well, have the capacity to not only inform people, which that's important, but sometimes to prompt emotional responses and sometimes action, maybe sometimes policy and new laws, right? To make things better in our communities. Sometimes stories about important issues told powerfully can actually move people to action. For example, maybe people in one community believe that children attending their local school need more educational resources. So they speak with their neighbors, they start talking door to door, they speak wherever they gather with folks at the local cafe or at the grocery store. And then they start to organize maybe public meetings and they go to the school board and talk about these issues, okay? They'll share information sometimes via social media or write letters to the editor or write opinion columns in the local newspaper, or they'll do interviews on TV. These are all ways of communicating shared values to try and address a need that they think needs that action. Another example is an issue that likely some of you who are at this meeting today who live in rural areas have already been aware of and maybe worked on. And that's reforming a lot of the policies that impact us as farmers. Some of you likely have spoken up at meetings about this or conducted interviews with media perhaps, or written about it in your local media or maybe at a bigger level. You've probably spoken about some of the needed reforms for farming with some of your fellow neighbors at least and fellow farmers. Some of you may have even traveled to Madison to talk to lawmakers there or even to Washington, D.C. This is just another example of how telling our stories about shared values and trying through those stories to try and enact positive change to occur. So Forrest, should we have these folks watch this video to get some ideas about what, you know, how to touch people emotionally, how to tell a story that has emotion and gets people to care about it?
Yeah. So I'm going to share this video from Wisconsin Farmers Union. It's also coincidentally titled Get Loud. That is not a coincidence. We did it on purpose. As you're watching this video, feel free to share in the chat what comes up for you when you see this. Think about maybe the stories of self that are coming up in this video. Think about how those stories of self are connecting, how people are finding common ground, the story of us, and figure out maybe what that challenge is, that urgency, the story of now. I'm going to go ahead and share that. And bear with me for one moment. I'm going to share sound and make sure we're all good to go here.
This is the farm that I run here in Holcomb with my family, my husband and our two boys. It's actually the farm that I grew up on. It was a dairy farm. My dad bought it when I was about 4 years old, and I grew up milking cows here in the old stone barn, and those were just the best memories that I have of my dad, were time spent in the barn together. But I remember I was in high school, and I think I had probably my whole life been thinking that's what I wanted to do, was grow up and, take over the farm. And we were in the milk house. We were washing the milkers. And Dad, I remember, was leaning against the pipeline, and he's like, I just don't think there's a future in this for you. The way that dairy farming is going in Wisconsin, it's really hard. And a big contributing factor to that is the monopolization in agriculture. And that, for me, having been at this for over a decade with him, was kind of soul crushing. That's what I really wanted to do in life. That's how I always envisioned raising my kids. But I think the realities are that, here in Wisconsin, we're losing a dairy farm a day, and we have some real changes that we need to make.
When I was young, a lot of the farms were, maybe 200 acres. There were homesteads all over the place dotting the countryside, and everyone had neighbors. More and more of those farms are disappearing completely. Those farms are being bought up. A lot of the houses are being raised and plowed over so that larger and larger farms can move in.
There's a concentration crisis in America. We've seen the collapse of a lot of family farms, first in hogs, and then we saw it in dairy, and now we're kind of seeing it in beef. What the term farmer means is kind of loosey-goosey at this point. I mean, you have the one that's been in a family for generations. They have a few hundred head of cattle. But then you have mega corporate farms where you have 35,000 dairy cows owned by one person. Now, is that person a farmer? I would say no. And those people exploit the positive association a lot of Americans have with the notion of being a farmer. They're the ones that get the most of the Farm Bill money. They're the ones that get most of the handouts. They're the ones that are prospering under this model. The question is do we want Bill Gates to be the largest owner of farmland in America? What kind of farming system do we want?
Starting a farm is an immense undertaking. You have to learn how to produce what you want to produce. You have to figure out how to be your own marketing agent. If you want to get into agriculture, not only are you looking at razor-thin margins, a massive amount of skills that you need to develop, but you're also looking at trying to compete against basically Wall Street.
70% of our produce comes from 3 states. In the meat industry, it's been really consolidated down to the big 4, they call them. There are 4 companies processing 85% of beef in the US. Throughout the pandemic, we saw beef prices in the store actually rising. Meanwhile, animals that I was shipping to market were bringing in less money.
Farmers have it the hardest. They're being both squeezed on the input and output side. So when they buy their seeds, when they buy their fertilizer, a lot of that's super concentrated, so they're paying monopoly prices for it. And then when they go to sell, they're selling to monopolies. So not only are they overpaying, but then they're getting underpaid.
Until we can figure out a way to create a system where farmers are getting fair payment for their goods, we're going to continue to lose family farms in Wisconsin.
How this concentrated economic power shows itself is in labeling. When you see a label made in the US, you think, I'm buying beef grown in the US. This monopoly power has basically corrupted the political system where they're able to take meat from Brazil and slap a made in the USA label on it. And so most people don't realize it.
Marketers out there have gotten really, really good at making labels look like they're from family farms. You're going to see great pictures of, farm scenes, and even the names of brands are really tied into, pasture and grazing and things like that, or words like natural that you don't actually even know the meaning of.
You're needing to help the consumer understand how you're different than what they're seeing on the grocery store shelves. And that can be really tricky because these large companies have whole teams of people who are marketing experts, and they know exactly what the consumer wants to hear. When you're really small, you don't have the same sway. You can't make the same negotiation with leasing a tractor for a very small amount of money, or buying feed in such large lots that you can negotiate discount pricing.
We're running into issues now with something we call right to repair. Through the years, our equipment has become so much more advanced and so much more technology involved. You have to have an equipment dealer technician come out and work on your equipment. That means that you also have to wait on that technician to be able to get out to you. So in some cases, it's actually held up harvests for people. The cost has been astronomical, and they have fewer options of where to go for those parts. The current food system right now is not serving farmers well. It's not serving laborers along the supply chain well. Honestly, it's not serving our consumers well if it's not healthful food. And I think we are at this kind of fork in the road where we can make some decisions that will either restore some vibrancy to rural America, or we can continue down the path that we're on.
I think the other thing to keep in mind too with this moment is how cyclical it is. I mean, we've been here before. A lot of this monopoly talk started in agriculture. I mean, it started with farmers a century ago being angry about the railroad monopolies, shortchanging them, the slaughterhouses shortchanging them. I mean, the first antitrust laws in the world come from farmers organizing.
There was this massive amount of consolidation, and the people rose up and they said no more of this.
That's the hope here now, is for farmers to lead, because they've led before.
We're in that moment again, and we have this huge opportunity.
I mean, change is already starting. This past summer, President Biden announced a big monopoly executive order, ordering a bunch of different government agencies to look in concentration. You're seeing bipartisan support right now to address the concentration we're seeing in the beef markets. You know, that is a big sign of hope.
Reach out to your legislators and demand some change, because I think we do need to get a little bit loud about this issue.
We have the laws we need on the books, we just need to be enforcing them.
A big step, I think, is really just educating ourselves as consumers who join Farmers Union and pay attention to these issues, but also pay attention in the grocery store.
Buy from the local farmers. Work with your school district. I mean, it's one thing when I individually buy the right thing. Schools buy a lot of stuff. There's a lot of purchasing power. So I mean, that's what I would encourage people to do, is really work with their local institutional buyers to buy the right thing. If we confront this problem, everyone kind of wins. From farmers to workers to the person who picks it, who processes it, who slaughters it, who transports it, who cooks it, who serves it. Guess what? They're in every congressional district in America.
I like to think that 10 or 15 years from now, I won't be sitting here in a position like my dad was, where he had to say that there wasn't a future on the farm. I want to be able to look my kids in the eye and say that they do have a chance to be farmers.
All right, I'm gonna take us back to the big group here.
So I saw a couple of reactions already in the chat, noting how showing that the video showed the impact of, you know, lack of what we would call good farm policy in some ways on, or its impact on real people, right? And that's exactly what we want you to see with that. Like that's one way why, that's why this video, that's partly why it's powerful, is it shows the real impact. You know, you see Danielle kind of tearing up, describing when her dad said, I don't know that you have a future doing this. That's maybe the most powerful moment in the whole thing, certainly one of them. Or then showing her kids at the end, right? Let us know in the chat what other reactions you guys have and what other powerful moments you saw in there, or powerful techniques that made you care about this.
I see Lynn mentioning that some of this is personal. Bill Gates bought a large section of land within 20 miles of her home. Yeah, right to repair also impacts diesel mechanics.
Yeah,
that's totally, yeah. So you can see how we're building these connections.
Yeah,
the kids, absolutely.
Yeah, kids is always a powerful one, right? And that was I thought a really effective way to end it.
Offering people a choice. Yes, we're going to talk about that choice and the urgency, definitely. Corporate trickery. Yeah. I want to keep us moving though. We've got a lot to cover. These are really awesome. This is wonderful. This is exactly on the right track. So thank you.
Yeah, I like real quick. I just like something Julie said here. Farmers Union's executive, Wisconsin Farmers Union's executive director. It is hopeful and makes us believe something can be done because of history. That is a meaningful point in there too, where toward the end where they discuss, hey, we've been here before and people rose up. So that's, you know, alluding to that's what we need to happen again.
Absolutely. I want to move on though, and I want to come back to that idea of, let's see here. I want to come back to that idea of urgency and talk about, can you all see this? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yep.
I want to talk about this idea of the story of now. This is a technique that we use. The story of now communicates an urgent problem. This is a threat, something that requires our immediate attention. I think one of the best examples of this, oh, sounds like we're having a little audio difficulty. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. I can hear you fine. All right. So a really powerful, in fact, one of the most powerful articulations of the story of now was in 1963. Dr. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. In this speech, he contrasts the liberatory dream of the civil rights movement with the nightmare of segregation. This speech, like all good stories of now, really it asks the listener to make a choice to either stand up for their values or not. And what happens when we make those choices? When we're telling our stories of now, it's like Dr. King did, we have to be really clear about what the stakes are. We have to communicate the dream, our vision, right, for the future, and contrast it with the nightmare that we're living in. And I understand nightmare is kind of a strong word, but I think that's part of the point. The problems in rural America are real. And in order to fix them, we have to make people understand the seriousness of what we're up against. Another important part of the story of now is that it gives us a way forward, a credible solution to the problems we face. History, like we saw in the video, we've been here before, right? We have to believe that change is possible for our own stories. If you believe that we can move from that nightmare to the dream, if you have hope, other people will notice that. If you believe it, they'll believe it. And I'll let Julian take it from there.
That's a good point, and that's kind of partly what we're trying to do through this is give you all the tools to tell your own stories in such a way that it can spread hope and can spread, can build unity and maybe, just maybe, impact change. So I'll give you a few kind of techniques and examples of making your audience feel a sense of urgency, right? Because that's partly what you're going to have to do if you want to enact change through story. If you want your audience to feel motivated to take some kind of action regarding an issue, you need to make people care about it. And one way to accomplish that goal is to make them feel a sense of urgency. Now, that sense of urgency must be real. Your audience most likely will see through attempts to create a false or heightened sense of urgency. We see this in advertising all the time, right? But there are lots of very real senses of urgency to convey out there. For instance, share how a failure to address dairy farming struggles in Wisconsin means that the state known to all of us as America's dairyland has actually led the nation in the number of dairy farmer bankruptcies in each of the past 3 years. I've written multiple stories about that, and it's striking, right? Or tell others who may doubt the seriousness of mental health struggles among farmers who are just trying their hardest to keep their farms financially viable about the personal struggles these farmers face with their mental health because there doesn't seem to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Or when describing the need for improved high-speed internet connection where you live, talk about how your internet barely works oftentimes, how your kids struggle to complete homework assignments because they lack quality internet, and how poor internet service hinders economic development in your hometown, and how that means your kids can't find enough of the kinds of good paid jobs, and they end up being forced to move elsewhere to take them. And bit by bit, rural communities continue to be eroded and lose their young talent. Too often, we spare our listeners the difficult challenges that are part of our story. We don't want to share those real difficulties, right? We're worried that what they might think of us. But what you find is that is exactly the kind of information that people need to hear to create a sense of urgency. And oftentimes it is exactly the way that they are feeling as well. So I'll give you one quick example of a story that I actually did some years ago. It was a written version, but then I also have been asked to speak about it many, many times, and still I'm asked to 8 years later. I was told all homeless people in Eau Claire who wanted a warm place out of the cold during winter months had access to those warm spaces. And I was just curious about it. So I started spending time out on the streets with that population. I went to shelters. I just hung out with them on the streets, sometimes a couple hours a night, sometimes all night, overnight. And it ended up being, just my luck, a historically cold and snowy winter. And there were many nights when I was out when it was 15 or 20 below or colder. Anyway, I ended up running a whole series of stories about that. And after the first big one ran, our newspaper, the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram at the time, was inundated with responses about people in disbelief. And subsequently, a whole bunch of actions took place to try and address homelessness in Eau Claire, including changing the rules at the shelter to not kick people out once it was below zero. And also, no matter how crowded it was, and also a whole bunch of new housing units were built. The reason I mention it is because I never thought just some simple words on print or on a screen that I wrote would make those kinds of changes. The reason it did is because I created a sense of urgency, and it was a very real sense of urgency because people were dying. Homeless people were dying because they didn't have anywhere inside to go when it was that cold that winter. So it's the power of a sense of urgency in terms of creating a narrative, in terms of prompting action. Or should we have folks split into groups and take their first venture into the chat rooms now?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for that, Julian. I'm going to share my screen again real quick. I want to share some questions with you all. So we're going to jump into breakout rooms here. We're going to have small rooms, 4 people each, and you're going to have a chance to talk amongst yourselves. And I want you to consider these 3 questions here. Consider these from your own perspective, right? What urgent challenge might you call on us, your listeners, to face? What is the vision that we could achieve if we act? And what action might you call upon us to take? We've got them posted in the chat as well. They're also on your worksheet. So yeah, as you get into these breakout rooms, think about these questions and start talking amongst yourselves from your own lives, from your own experiences. What do you think the answers to these questions might be? And this is not to say that you have to have all the answers right now. This is just a way to kind of start thinking about some of this stuff. So I think we'll go ahead and break into the breakout rooms right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And yeah, just about some of these questions. Now I'm asking you to go out on a limb a little bit here and talk to each other, but I think you can do it. I think it's going to be really good. And then after about 8 minutes or so, we'll come back and we'll share in the chat again some of our responses to these questions. So yeah, can we get those breakout rooms ready? All right, I see that folks are coming back into the big room. That's wonderful. If you could put yourselves back on mute and start, drop in the chat if you noticed anything or had any reactions or thoughts about the discussion that y'all just had. I hope it made sense. If it didn't, you can ask me questions too. Whatever kind of came up for you during that 8 minutes that you want to share with the group.
Especially as it pertains to those 3 questions, but any other thoughts are very welcome as well.
Yeah, we'll give you a few minutes to type, but yeah, for this one, ooh, those are nice ones, Lynn. Thank you.
Yeah, Lynn.
Conservation, sustainability, and legacy. Yeah, right. Sustainability, that's like that vision that we could achieve if we take action. That's wonderful. Any other thoughts?
Oh, wow, getting a lot.
Yeah, oh, some great stuff. Rick says, easy to talk about challenges, harder to come up with actions.
Amen.
Ain't that the truth? Well said, Rick. Let's see.
Interesting challenges of the public perception of farmers. I agree with that. And honestly, after spending a lot of the last couple of months across rural Wisconsin, talking with farmers and others in rural areas, the stereotypes are not nearly always true. I'm really impressed by and amazed by the people I've been meeting. So that's a really interesting point, and I agree with it.
Let's see. Molly here says, customer outreach, trying to tackle running a farm and marketing, selling, etc. That is huge. Yeah. Yeah.
Development pressure versus land access for growing food. You're hearing more and more and more talk about that all across this state and the nation, frankly. That's a really big issue.
Great example of like kind of in some cases a nightmare scenario versus what we want for our land, right? We want to have people on the land growing food, young farmers. That's that vision of the future.
Interesting. Entrepreneurship for farmers that is effective for our local school districts. You heard that mentioned in the video by the guy from Yale as a an opportunity. And there's a little more of that going on. I just know from talking with DATCAP folks, but there's definitely room for a lot more.
All right, I'm going to shift gears now. We're going to head over into the story of us. I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully this works. All right, the story of us. So when I think about the story of us, it's experiential, not categorical. This is the language that Marshall Gans uses, and I think it's really appropriate. Stories of us are not about like our identity markers. They're about the values and experiences that we share with others in our community. So most of the stories that we tell as people are stories of us. Something like 80% of the time that parents spend interacting with their young children is telling stories. And those are all stories of us. Think about like fables or religious stories, national and cultural stories. These are all stories of us. Stories of us are so fundamental to our shared values. They communicate through emotional content our shared values. When we tell stories of us, we want to communicate our personal values to the people around us. A story of us works really well when we can honestly and clearly communicate what we believe in a concrete rather than an abstract way. So a good story of us can be hard to tell. It's a story about strong emotions, a story about what you love, about what's a threat to you. It's important that we don't shy away from these emotions, as Julian said, because we as humans understand values on an emotional rather than kind of unemotional rather than analytical terms. This can be simple, right? Sharing emotion can be simple. It can be as simple as describing how you felt in the moment when you faced a challenge. My heart was racing. Or it can be like just about naming the emotion, right? In that moment, I felt angry. Just naming that emotion can be powerful. So this is how we can get people to understand our values, by bringing real emotion into our stories of us, by having an emotionally honest accounting of our values. When we do this, we open the door for others to do the same in return. We can create common ground, and that's how we start to tell the story of us. So Julian, you got any examples?
Yeah, sure. So when you're telling stories of us, or stories that have the power to bring us together, one way to do that is to choose story topics that other people can relate to. Maybe it's something simple and heartwarming, like the enjoyment of gathering with family and loved ones around the dinner table during the holidays. Maybe it's the community pride that residents feel when they get together at high school athletic events or band concerts or plays. Maybe it's a story about the importance of farmers who are feeding America and how we need to make structural changes to ensure that they can continue to do that vitally important work. One effective technique to help create a sense of the collective by being inclusive is by being inclusive in your language choice. In other words, as much as you can, tell your personal story, but then combine it and use the language of we instead of just the language of me. Research has shown that when you feel genuine emotion, others do too, because we are social creatures after all. Being vulnerable about the real situation, sometimes difficult situation, that you and your community find yourself in, it helps bring other people in, because the reality is they feel that vulnerability too. It often just takes someone with the courage and the ability to describe that vulnerability and why it matters. And sometimes that then other people will say, yes, I feel that way too. And it starts to build consensus. For an example of a story that unites people, there's a bunch of them I can come up with, but in that video that we watched earlier, it was really powerful when Danielle told her personal story about the struggles to continue on her family farm and how her dad tells her, he doesn't think that there's a future for her on the farm, right? It's something she's always envisioned doing, and it's heartbreaking to think that she maybe isn't going to be. Thankfully, she still is. That story expands beyond Danielle's self-story by telling the story of Lauren as well, and then it becomes a story of us when they extend it to the guy from Yale who talks much more broadly about how their story is common all across Wisconsin and all across the United States amongst farmers, right? So this is a story that is very powerful individually at first, but then it goes beyond the individual story, talks about how it impacts farmers, consumers, and entire communities. It's a story that, like many stories of us, is actually an intersection of the story of self and the story of now. And then those elements then make it a story of us and draw people into it. There are multiple other stories I could talk about that show the ability to create a story of us. One of them that I'm going to showcase, though, is actually, I'm going to highlight my Wisconsin Farmers Union colleagues. There was a lot of work by this organization to bring attention to the need to expand the number of smaller meat processors and to combat, the big business dangers of the big four meat processors. There's a whole lot of people here who can tell you a lot more about it than me, but I was aware of the impact that this group had already had on that front, but I became more aware of it during an interview last week with DATCAP Secretary Randy Romansky, who told me in some detail about how WFU's work on this topic helped not only educate and inform, but helped build public pressure by becoming a story of us, and it ultimately prompted the state to work to address the issue.
Yeah, some powerful examples of stories of us. I think Danielle and Lauren's story really resonates. I just think that's a really nice one. So I want to move into our next little discussion time here. I've got the questions up on the screen, and we're going to throw them down in the chat as well. But for this one, we're going to have 8 minutes again in the breakout room. The questions will also be on your worksheet that I handed out. Definitely have that worksheet open if you don't already. And but yeah, let's talk through them really quick. So, who is the us that you're asking to join you, right? We have to be really clear about this. Who is that us? What motivating values do the people around you share? What has brought people together? And what experiences have you shared? And maybe you're at the point where those values are out there and they're floating around, but the storyteller hasn't been there to bring them together, to create that us. And that's one of the things that we're really trying to do. So maybe there's a potential us out there that you want to bring together. So we'll jump into those breakout rooms again and give that a think, chat about it. The questions are there in the chat and on your worksheet, and we'll see you in 8 minutes. All right, welcome back, everybody. Drop in the chat if anything useful came out of that discussion time. What came up for you? What came up around this idea of the story of us, about connecting people, shared values? What did you think? Yeah, who is this us you are asking to join you? What motivating values do they share? What experiences have you shared? So those questions around the story of us. I'd love to hear some thoughts in the chat. Ooh, Rick, yes, more personal conversations. More conversations about those real emotions, maybe. Yeah, that's a good one. What are your thoughts on that? Awesome.
That's interesting. The us are non-farmers we want to educate on the reality of farming and farmers' lives. There's tons and tons and tons of work that needs to be done on that front by all of us, media included.
Yeah, I think, as Farmers Union, that's something we have to think about. The people at all levels of the food system, right? That's kind of a big us, might share some similar values or experiences. Challenge is to reach across generations with some issues. That one's really important, I think. Yeah, it's I think about young farmers a lot and the struggles they have versus people who are like getting out of farming, who are at the end of their careers. People who eat, yes, well said. Marcy says, we talked about relationship building. Yeah, building relationships based on values. Well said. Julian, what do you think? Anything standing out to you?
Well, I like the from Mike, considering the emotions that connect with lawmakers and staffers that would motivate them to support fairness for farmers legislation. And again, that's a tough nut to crack because obviously people have been doing it for a while with not nearly as much success as they like. But I do think personal stories and showing the impact on what this really means to individual people and telling those individual stories and that are representative of big numbers, right? I think that has power.
Yeah, yeah.
We want food to come from farms as close to home as possible. There's getting to be more movement along those lines. It's not nearly mainstream, but there's at least hope.
Cool. Well, those are some great comments. I wish we could get to all of them, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know you all are farmers, you're busy people. I want to move on and talk about the story of self. Let me just make sure that you all can see this. Hopefully we're in good shape. Yeah, so the story of self. You can tell maybe by this graphic that my story of self is that I was not a graphic designer. But for real, the story of self is the kind of most foundational story that we tell. Everybody has a story of self to tell, and everybody's an expert in their own story. I especially love to talk about this with farmers because farmers understand that farming is a lot of work and it's complicated, and nobody knows the ins and outs of your farm the way you do, right? You all are experts in your own farm, right? And I guess when we're telling the story of self, we think about like the feelings that go along with your farm, with this piece of land that you've put your life's work in some cases into, right? There's a lot of feelings there. You're an expert not only in your farm, but in those feelings as well, right? You know intimately the joys, the successes, the pain that you have felt as you have worked this piece of land in whatever way that is. So these are the kinds of experiences that we want to tap into when we're talking about our stories of self, these experiences that we hold dear. Effective stories of self, they focus on one decisive moment in our lives when we made a choice to stand up for our values. So in order to kind of figure this out, we use a really simple formula. We call it challenge, choice, and outcome. Right? We've got you, the character. We've got a challenge in your life. It could be some uncertainty. It could be a threat of some kind, a challenge in your life though. And we have, and it should be a challenge that where you made a choice to stand up for your values. And ask yourself, as you start to think about this, and maybe an experience of your life that kind of maps onto this formula, think about where you were. What was around you? What did you feel like? What did you feel like physically, right? What was the outcome of that choice, the eventual outcome? So what we really want to do, like I said, is tell a story from your actual lived experience and really focus in on that, a moment, a challenge, choice, and outcome where you did live by your values. It sounds simple, but that's important because oftentimes in these conversations we're going to be having, it's about brevity, right? You might be in an office in DC in front of a lawmaker or a staffer. You might have 1 minute to get your story across. So that's why we focus on these three things: challenge, choice, and outcome. It can stay really brief. And I'll turn it over to Julian here to maybe dive into that a little bit more.
Well, you know, I struggle with being brief, Forrest, but it is important to keep your story simple, keep your story relatively brief, especially depending on your audience, right? If you're talking to lawmakers, you don't have much time to talk with them. You need to get them interested right away. And one of the best ways to do that is the story of self. So I was just almost deleting this as I heard Forrest talking, but I'm going to hit it again from a little different point because it's so important. All of us have a story to tell, and all of those stories matter, every single one of them. I can't tell you how many times people have told me, well, who would want to hear about my story, Julian? It's just common. It's experiences that all of us have. And I say, That's the power of your story. Your story is individual. And if you can tell it powerfully, and it's about something that so many of us experience, then that will resonate with people. Maybe it's the joy of becoming a parent, right? Or the empty sorrow of losing a parent when your parent dies. They're common experiences we all can relate to, but every single one of our stories is individual. And telling your story is powerful because nobody else knows your story like you do. You are the expert. Even if you don't think you know anything, the first thing about telling a story, you are the expert in your story. People can debate facts, and it seems like that happens increasingly in our modern world, right? But no matter what, nobody can debate your story. That's why in this day and age, especially, I think personal stories, story of self, has real power. To make these stories matter, to get the attention of people, if they're going to cause any kind of a change, a positive change, the story needs to stand out. But how do you do that? I mean, I do this for a living, writing those kinds of stories, and I ask myself sometimes, how do I make them stand out? Well, one way is to share the real, sometimes very raw emotions that go along with that story. And we've talked a little bit about this before, but it seems like all of us, myself included, sometimes we want to tell a more boring, sanitized story. We don't want our imperfections to stand out. But describe the joy of reuniting with a long lost friend, or the paralyzing fear of losing a loved one, or the butterflies in your stomach before a job interview, or how nervous I was before starting this very discussion tonight, okay, this presentation. Be honest with your listeners and be open. Don't hold back. And by doing so, you will create trust with them. They will think, yes, I know what that feels like, because we are all human after all. Another effective means of telling the story of self, or in any story, is using details in your story. The details help paint a picture in your listener or reader's mind, and they help them connect with your story and better envision its importance and its impact. Another effective technique used to tell the stories of self is to describe the impact of some action or policy on your life or the lives of others. How exactly does contaminated drinking water affect you and your neighbors? How does a lack of jobs where you live that forces many people, including maybe your own children or your loved ones, to move elsewhere for employment, how does that impact your family and your community? Don't be afraid to describe those emotions. So another example of a story that communicates values through choices. Again, I'm going to highlight my Wisconsin Farmers Union friends. A group of Wisconsin Farmers Union members from Wisconsin's South Central chapter sought to change regulations that prevented the sale of food prepared in homes and not in commercial kitchens to be sold in the state. That was illegal in Wisconsin. You had to prepare it. If you're going to sell food, you had to prepare it in an approved and inspected commercial kitchen, right? Couldn't just make it in your home. So members of this group told their stories of self related to this topic. And then by doing so, and doing so effectively and working very diligently, quite frankly, and connecting with lots of people, those stories resonated. And others said, oh yeah, I make food that same way too. You mean I couldn't sell it? I can't even bring it to the local school to as a bake sale. And so over time, they built momentum and ultimately connected with lawmakers and ultimately changed the law in Wisconsin that now allows them to sell home-baked goods. So once again, these simple stories of self can build momentum, they can build urgency, the story of now, they can build connectedness, and sometimes, just sometimes, through diligence and good storytelling, they change policy. So Forrest, let's talk about, the story of self is really like probably the biggest and most powerful of these three storytelling modalities that we're talking about tonight. Let's have folks break into their groups again, and can you walk them through the exercise you want them to do?
Yeah, you bet. So yeah, like Ian said, the story of self kind of contains these other stories within it. This story of self is our first stepping stone to organizing. Really, when we as organize, when my organizing team talks about organizing, the first thing that we do, the first training that we did was this training on the story of self. One of the first. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to break out into our final small group time of the evening. And what we're going to do is go ahead and post the link to that worksheet in the chat. I want to make sure that everybody has that worksheet available to them, because there's a little bit more than I can talk through in a couple minutes in that worksheet that I want you to do. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to take 5 minutes in your small group, quietly think about your story of self. Try to really zoom in on that moment of challenge, choice, and outcome. So you were faced with a challenge at some point in your life. You met that challenge with a choice to live by your values, and there was an outcome. That's it. It's so simple, but it sounds simple. So think about, zoom in on that moment and experience from your actual life. Take 5 minutes and you can write about it. You can just think about it, whatever works best for you. And then you're going to take 10 minutes in the small group setting. I want to have 2 people share their stories, their challenge, choice, and outcome in 2 minutes or less. 2 different people are going to share their story in 2 minutes. Remember, when we're talking to lawmakers, got to be brief. When we're talking we're doing public comment at a county board meeting, it's got to be brief. So we really want to keep it to that 2 minutes. And then we've got some discussion questions for you to talk through after you've told those stories of self. And those are listed in the worksheet. So again, please do click on that worksheet document in the chat and yeah, take a look at that. Cameron also threw some stuff in the chat here, some questions to kind of get you started. I'll go ahead and throw you into those breakout rooms right now, and we'll make it happen. Some stories of self. All right, we're all coming back here. We're gonna just take some time to debrief a little bit. If you wanna, anything at all that came up from that conversation, if you wanna put it down there in the chat. It could be an experience or anything that came up for you. And I see that we're at about 2 minutes to 7:30. I think we'll try to wrap things up pretty quickly here, but we might just go 3 or so minutes over. Hopefully, if you have to jump off, I totally understand. Thanks a lot for coming, but we will just give it a few extra minutes here just so we can finish up. Yeah, any thoughts in the chat? Anything that came up for you when you were telling your story of self, or when you heard somebody else's story of self? What did you think? Was it hard to think of like a specific moment when you made a choice, when there was a challenge, or was it easy? I would also encourage you too to hang on to this worksheet if you want to keep thinking about it. Certainly, this is not the end of learning how to tell your story of self. I'm still learning how to tell my story. I think we all are. Julian's been at this for a long time.
And I'm still learning too. There were some really great discussions going on in the breakout room I was in. Unfortunately, we ran out of time at the end, but a couple of really powerful stories, people talking about, this is where here was a challenge I faced. Here were the values that I, use, that I relied upon to make that choice. And here are some struggles with it. It was some really thoughtful stuff and definitely some powerful stories to be told.
Cynthia,
it is hard to get it in 2 minutes. You're right, Gail.
Cynthia, would you be willing to come off mute and share a little bit more about what you said in the chat?
Sure, if I can find my unmute. Okay, I think I did it.
Yep.
Yeah, I was talking about my story of self really had nothing to do with farming. It had to do with being diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 29. And it was 1993 at the time when the pink ribbons were everywhere and everybody was happy about the gift of having cancer. And my choice was that I wasn't going to put up with that nonsense and I wasn't going to adopt that story. It ran contrary to medical research, scientific research, medical outcomes. And so the outcome has been that I've I've been very influential, both locally and nationally, in shifting the conversation over the years away from that rah-rah story to the realities of living with cancer and the way it affects you over time. And I was thinking that that same kind of, I guess, rhetorical move is what I hope to bring to how I want to talk about um, farm heirs who inherit a farm but don't live on the farm anymore. I want those heirs to hold on to that farm legacy and not to sell out to the highest bidder. And if they do end up selling, to sell to other family farmers in the area, not to sell to Bill Gates. So I think going against, conventional wisdom, being willing to stand out and say, I'm not going to do what everybody else says we should be doing or thinking or, going along with.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Cynthia. I really appreciate that. I wish we had time for one more. Ooh, we're at 7:30. We got to wrap up here, folks, but thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Julian to give us on it for us. Wrap it all up. I'm going to share my screen because we got some nice pictures.
All right, and I'm going to give you the condensed version of this because we are just bear with me 1 second because we are getting toward the very end here. So you've had some time. We've gone over these different ways of telling stories of us now in self. And, you've learned some about some of the important pieces of storytelling and your story that you want to tell. Remember, identify your story. Pick something that matters to you, something that you would like to see maybe changed or further action taken upon. Remember that you have the power to tell a story and your story matters. So many people don't believe that. Your story matters. I can't tell you that enough. Make your story direct, pick one main issue, then use details to make your story more interesting. Remember to talk about the impact that story has, not only on you, but on others like you. Remember that the story of us and the commonality of theme there. You're not the only person impacted by this issue, most likely. Your story is super powerful, and then talk about how you are one of many who are impacted by this story. And that's when you can build consensus behind a story. All of us are increasingly busy these days, but it's important that all of you start to at least try to tell your stories, because when we all do that, that's when we can build public pressure and we can enact real positive change in rural America. You can do it. Little old me has done it before on multiple different topics. I know you guys can do it too. Your story really does matter. Please know that you can reach out to me or my fellow Wisconsin Farmers Union communications team, probably folks with National Farmers Union as well. Please reach out to us if you want to tell your story, and we want you to tell your story, okay? If you can post, if you have a story you want to tell and you're committed to telling, start to post it in our chat right now. I'd love to see some of the ideas that you folks are going to talk about, what you think your story is. We'll help you develop it, but at least commit to doing this work. It's very important. Thank you so much for joining us. And Forrest, you can wrap up with any of the last comments.
Yeah, you bet. I threw our contact info, myself and Julian, up there. We're both available. I wanted to see if our NFU friends wanted to throw their contact info in the chat or say a final word here. Let them have the last word, and then would not be an organizer if I didn't make an ask. So I am going to post the link to nfu.org/join if you're not a member of your local farmers union. I highly recommend that you take a look at that page there. There it is in the chat. Cameron posted it for us. It's good stuff, folks. Farmers Union is doing some really good work at the national level and here in Wisconsin at the state level. So yeah, NFU folks, anything you want to share, or if you want to post your info in the chat, go for it.
Sure thing, Forrest. Thanks to you and to Julian, to the whole WFU crew. This has been really great to get us all National Farmers Union members, other folks watching, kind of in the spirit of storytelling as we get ready for the NFU fly-in just 2 weeks from now. So this will, like you mentioned a number of times through the presentation, that we'll be ready to share our story with legislators, with staffers, with administration officials, as we talk about a lot of farmers unions priorities in just a few weeks here. So check out nfu.org for more information about the organization, and nfu.org/fly-in. I'll drop that in the chat to get more details about what we'll be talking about. So thanks again, and appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for all of us for joining us. It's much appreciated.
One last thing, I'm going to post just a couple other links, or I'll have Cameron post just a couple other links in the chat. The Get Loud video that we showed, and then a link to Marshall Gans and the Leading Change Network. This is where we got a lot of our information from tonight. I just wanted to share it with you. They've got a lot more stuff on there if you want to do a deeper dive into storytelling. I will also be doing a follow-up email with all of you. I'll have a little evaluation form if you'd like to give us some feedback on our presentation tonight. And then just some of these links to resources as well. So look for a follow-up email from me tomorrow. And please, if you have a story or you want to talk about any of this further, reach out to Julian and myself. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you, really, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you all for being here. And yeah, solidarity.